A city with so much wealth, Dallas got its starts from war profiteering, exploiting cheap slave labor during the Civil War. This is a preview of Fair Park, a Triumphalist Vision of White Supremacy. This presentation is a part of the De-Racialize the Dallas Landscape series, which is part of the Shawnee Project. At Fair Park, at the entryway to the building called Grand Place, on the right you'll see a plaque. The plaque is a tribute to Texas women in the Civil War. This plaque is dated 1964. You can see it in the lower right-hand corner. I'm going to read the plaque. Civilian duties of 90,000 Texas men fighting for the Confederacy fell to wives back home in land of few factories and an enemy blockade that cut down on imports. Women had to run businesses and farms for their absent men, who committed to the uncertain males their letters of instruction, yet with the help of children, old men, and loyal slaves, furnished Army and the Confederacy with grain, meat, and cotton for home consumption and foreign exchange for guns, gunpowder, factory goods, drugs, and other supplies. Ran newspapers, loaded shells, made gun caps, did man's work of many kinds, in addition to homemaking, sewing, nursing, teaching, and childcare. Made medicines from herbs and plants, grew poppies and squeezed the seed pods to supply opiates to the hospitals, carded cotton and wool, spun and wove, then dyed the homemade cloth with barks or roots, plaited palmetto or corn shucks to make hats, made coffee of acorns or vegetables, tea of sage or orange leaves. On 2,000 miles of coastline and frontier, faced personal hazards from invasion or Indian raids. Elsewhere were in peril from marauders. Through the 4 years, won admiration for their pluck and maintained faith enough to help rebuild the defeated South. The title is misleading because this isn't really about all Texas women in the Civil War. It's about white Texas women in the Civil War. And it isn't really about all white Texas women in the Civil War. It's about Texas women in the Civil War who supported the Confederacy. Many white people in Texas did not support the Confederacy and were subjects of persecution. This title misleads by erasing the fact that there was dissent during the Civil War in Texas and resistance against the Confederacy, and creates the idea that there was unanimous support for the Confederacy. The name on the application for this plaque is Lester N. Fitzhugh, who spoke at local Neo-Confederate functions with local Neo-Confederate groups. That's why you see this reference to loyal slaves on the plaque. The idea of loyal slaves was a standard idea in the Lost Cause mythology, the ideology about the Civil War, slavery, and Reconstruction of the Neo-Confederate groups. So, what really happened during the Civil War? John H. Cochran, a prominent member of Dallas society and politics, wrote a history of Dallas County. It was published in 1928. Cochran has a chapter on Dallas during the Civil War period. And in 1928, Dallas residents would not be embarrassed to be known as white supremacists, and therefore were very candid on the issues of race and slavery. So let's read what Cochran has to say on his first page in this chapter. But Dallas County, from 1859 to 1861, had made such rapid and successful progress in the production of wheat, corn, forage meat, and other necessary supplies of food She was recognized as the center of the food-producing counties of Texas, so much that the Confederate government established and maintained a general quartermaster's and commissary headquarters at Dallas for the collection of food and supplies for the Army of the Trans-Mississippi Department. Also established a transportation and recruiting department there and a manufacturing department at Lancaster, where arms were repaired and pistols manufactured. Dallas was general headquarters for all these departments, so the officers and their families and all necessary details made Dallas their temporary home during the war, thus supplying the place of the enlisted soldiers. So how was Dallas County able to raise all this food and be such a center of supplies for the Confederate Army? On the next page, Cochrane explains how this was done. Reading from his book, besides, a large number of Negroes were brought into Dallas County for food and for protection during the war, and were gladly hired to the citizens for their food and clothes. Nearly every family which had no Negroes of their own hired one or more of these Negroes and were thus enabled to cultivate all their land in wheat, corn, and oats, so Dallas County continued to be the great food-producing center of Texas. Its reputation in this respect became so great that many desirable citizens were attracted by its prosperity and permanently settled in the county and contributed much to its future development. Cochrane's not completely candid. Notice how he avoids the entire topic of slavery in this passage. The plaque has these poor defenseless white women squeezing pea pods, making tea of orange leaves, weaving fabric, making hats out of corn shocks, all by themselves, poor and defenseless. Oh dear, all defenseless with Indians out there, marauders. The reality is that slaveholders in the Confederate States were fleeing to Texas with their slaves to prevent their emancipation by the advancing American armies. Flooded with refugee slaveholders' slaves, Dallas residents were able to exploit slave labor for just the cost of feeding and clothing the slaves. By supplying the Confederacy, they became rich with war profiteering off a war to preserve slavery by exploiting slaves. The presence of a large Confederate military supply operation hardly left them defenseless. In this city with so much wealth, what has happened to the descendants of the slaves whose exploitation enriched the founders of Dallas?